Expectant silence filled the amphitheatre as Magnus strode towards the plinth.
He walked with his head held high and his feathered cloak trailing behind him, looking straight at the Emperor's dais. This was no walk of the accused, but the stride of a righteous man fighting against unjust accusers. Ahriman had never been prouder to be one of the 1,000 Sons. Magnus bowed to the Emperor and to Malcador, and then turned to face Fulgrim and Sanguinius, bows of comradeship. In a move that spoke of grace in the face of adversity, he also gave Mortarion and Uther word-make courteous acknowledgments. Magnus was every inch the gentleman polymath who never forgot himself, even as his enemies united against him. He mounted the plinth and rested his hands on the wooden lectern. He paused, sweeping his gaze across the assembled men and women, favouring all of them with his attention.
The fearful and the unbelieving, the abominable and the murderers, the whoremongers and sorcerers, idolaters and all liars, shall have their part in the lake with burning fire and brimstone,
said Magnus, as though reading through a text.
These words are taken from a book written thousands of years ago in a forgotten age, ironically from a passage named Revelations. This is what people thought in those barbaric times. It shows what savagery we come from, and how easy it is for our species to turn upon one another. These words of fear sent thousands to their deaths over the millennia. And for what? To salve the fears of ignorant men who had not the wit to embrace the power of new ideas.
Magnus stepped away from the plinth, circling the amphitheatre like a lecturing iterator. Where Mortarion had hectored the assembly with venom, Magnus spoke as though every member of the assembly, from the lowliest adept to the Emperor himself, were old friends gathered for a good-natured debate.
If one of us were to walk among the people of those times, they would kill us for the technology we possess, thinking it witchcraft or unclean devilment. For example, before the writings of Erasticus of Samos, men believed that Earth was flat, an unbroken plain, where the ocean simply fell off the edges. Can you imagine anything more ridiculous? Now we take the sphericity of planets as granted. Much later, priestly scholars thought that Terra was the center of the cosmos, and that the sun and planets revolved around it. The man who challenged this geocentric foolishness was tried for heresy and forced to recant his beliefs. Now we know our place in the galaxy.
Magnus paused before Mortarion, meeting the hostile glare of the Death Lord with one of quiet amusement.
From the deepest desire often comes the deadliest hatred, and false words are not only evil in themselves, but they infect the hearts of all those who hear them with evil. Imagine what we will know in 1,000 years and really think what we were doing here.
Magnus turned from Mortarion and walked to the center of the amphitheatre, lifting his hands out to his sides and slowly turning on the spot as he spoke.
Imagine the Imperium in the future, a golden utopia of enlightenment and progress, where the scientist and the philosopher are equal partners with the warrior in crafting a bounteous future. Now imagine the people of that glorious age looking back through the mist of time to this moment. Think what they will know, and what they will make of this travesty. They would weep to know how close the flame of enlightenment had come to being snuffed out. The art and the science of questioning everything is the source of all knowledge, and to abandon that will doom us to slow decay. An imperium of darkness and ignorance, where those who dare to pursue knowledge, whatever the cost to themselves, are regarded with suspicion. That is not the imperium I believe in. That is not the imperium I wish to be a part of. Knowledge is the food of the soul, and no knowledge can be thought of as wrong, so long as the seeker after truth is a master of what he learns. Nothing worth knowing can be taught. It must be learned with the blood and sweat of experience, and there are no greater scholars of that ilk than the 1,000 Sons. Even as we fight in the forefront of the Emperor's crusade, we study the things others ignore, questing for knowledge in places others fear to tread. There are no truths unknown, no secrets too hidden, and no paths too labyrinthine for us to follow. for they lead us upwards into enlightenment. Hard-won knowledge is of no value unless it is put into practice. Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Willing is not enough. We must do.
Magnus smiled, and Ahriman saw that he had won over great swathes watching him.
With that in mind, I beg your indulgence a little longer,
said Magnus.
In the tale I will detail, there is an ancient legend of old earth that speaks of 3 men of Aegina who lived in a cave deep in the mountains,
said Magnus with the warmth of a natural storyteller. Although he had heard the story before, Ahriman found himself captivated by Magnus's voice, the natural charisma that loaded every commanding word.
These men lived shut off from the light of the world, and they would have lived in permanent darkness were it not for a small fire that burned in a circle of stones at the heart of the cave. They ate lichen that grew on the walls and drank cold water from an underground stream. They lived, but what they had was not living. Day after day, they sat around the fire, staring into the flickering embers and bouncing flames, believing that its light was the only light in the world. The shadows made shapes and patterns on the walls, and this delighted them greatly. In their own way, they were happy, moving from day to day, without ever knowing what lay beyond the flickering circle of light.
Magnus paused in the recital, allowing the audience to imagine the scene and picture the dancing shadows on the cave wall.
But one day, a mighty storm blew over the mountain. But so deep were the men that only the merest breath of it reached the cave. The fire danced in the wind, and the men laughed to see new patterns on the wall. The wind died, and they went back to contemplating the fire, much as they had always done. But one of the men got up and walked away from the fire, which surprised the other men greatly, and they bade him return to sit with them. This lone man shook his head, for he alone had a thirst to learn more about the wind. He followed it as it retreated from the cave, climbing steep cliffs, crossing chasms, and negotiating many perils, before he finally saw a faint haze of light ahead of him. He climbed out of the cave, emerging onto the side of the mountain, and looked up at a blazing sun. Its light blinded him, and he fell to his knees, overcome by its beauty and warmth. He feared that he had burned out his eyes, but in a little while vision returned, and he hesitantly looked around him. He had come out of the cave high on the mountain flank, and the world was spread out before him in all its glory, glittering green seas and endless fields of golden corn. He wept to see these things, distraught that he had wasted so many years in darkness, oblivious to the glory of the world around him, a world which had been there all along, but which his limited vision had denied him.
The primarch stopped, looking at the stars, and his rapt audience followed his gaze, as though picturing the blazing sun of his story.
"Can you imagine what it felt like?"
asked Magnus, his voice racked with emotion.
"To have spent your entire life staring at a small fire and thinking that it was the only light in the world, only to be then confronted by the sun." The man knew he had to tell his friends of this miraculous discovery, and he made the journey back to the cave where the other men sat, still staring into the fire and smiling vacuously at the shadows on the wall. The man who had seen the sun looked at the place he used to call home, and saw it for the prison it truly was. He told the others what he had seen, but they were not interested in the far-fetched tales of a burning eye in the sky. All they wanted to do was live their lives as they had always lived them. They called him mad and laughed at him, continuing to stare at the fire as it was the only reality they knew.
Ahriman had first heard this story as a philosopher in the Corvidae temple, when Magnus had mentored him prior to facing the Dominus Liminus. He heard the same note of bitterness in the primarch's voice that he had heard back then, a precisely modulated pitch that conveyed the proper measure of anguish and frustration at the blindness of the men in the cave. "How," Magnus's tone said, "could anyone turn away from such light once they knew of its existence?"
The man could not understand his friend's reluctance to travel to the world above,
continued Magnus.
but he resolved that he would not take the refusal to come with him as an end to the matter. He would show them the light, no matter what, and if they would not come to the light, then he would bring the light to them. And so the man climbed back to the world of light and began to dig. He dug until he widened the cave mouth. He dug for 100 years and then 100 more, until he had dug away the top of the mountain. Then he dug downwards a great pit in the heart of the mountain until he broke through into the cave, where his fellows sat around the fire.
Magnus fell silent, the words trailing off. Although Ahriman knew it was a theatrical pause rather than any moment of introspection. Knowing how the story ended, Ahriman was not surprised that Magnus had stopped there. In the original version of the tale, the man's friends were so terrified by what they were shown that they killed the man and retreated deeper into the cave with their fire to live their lives in perpetual twilight. The tale was an allegorical parable of the futility of sharing fundamental truths with those with too narrow a perception of reality. By telling it selectively, Magnus had broken the covenant with the audience. But none of them would ever know. Instead, he continued the tale with fresh words woven out of his imagination.
The men were amazed at what he showed them, the light that they had been missing for all their lives, and the golden joy that could be theirs, were they just brave enough to take his hand and follow him. One by one they climbed out of the dark cave and saw the truth of the world around them, all its wonders and all its beauty. They looked back at the dank, lightless cave that they had called home and were horrified by how limited their understanding of the world was. They heaped praise upon the man who had shown them the way to the light and honored him greatly, for the world and all its bounty were now theirs to explore forevermore.
Magnus let this new ending wash over the amphitheatre, and no member of the theatrical imperialis had given so commanding a performance. A rolling wave of applause erupted from the tears, and Magnus smiled, the perfect blend of modesty and gratitude. Sanguinius and Fulgrim were on their feet, though Mortarion and the Death Guard remained as stoic as ever. As pitch-perfect as Magnus's delivery had been, Ahriman saw that not all of the audience was won over, although it was clear that the case against Magnus and the Thousand Sons was no longer as cut and dry as the accusers were hoping. Magnus raised his hands to quell the applause, as though abashed to be so acclaimed.
The man knew he had to show his friends the truth about the world around them,
He said,
and just as it was his duty to save his friends from their dull, sightless existence, it is our duty to do the same for humanity. The Thousand Sons alone of all the legions have seen the light beyond the gates of the Empyrean. That light will free us from the shackles of our mundane perception of reality and allow the human race to stand as masters of the galaxy. Just like the men around the fire needed to be shown the glorious future that lay within their grasp, so too does humanity. The knowledge the Thousand Sons are gathering will allow everyone to know what we know, to see what we see. Humanity needs to be led upwards with small steps, with their eyes gradually opened lest the light blind them. That is the ultimate goal of the Thousand Sons. Our future as a race is at stake. My friends, I urge you not to throw away this chance of enlightenment, for we are at a tipping point in the history of the Empyrean. Think of the future and how this moment will be judged in the millennia to come.
Magnus bowed to the cardinal points of the amphitheatre.
Thank you for your attention,
He said,
This is all I have to say.